Greetings all. Thank you for coming to our conference on African writing and futurity. My name is Margie Adams, and today I will be presenting on the Poetics of Decolonization. For this project, while I will consider poetics to refer to how we think about techniques in writing, I want to expand beyond this idea to investigate how decolonial theory hinges on the creative form, specifically poetry. What are the poetics of decolonization? How does creative writing undergird decolonial strategies? To respond to these questions, I will be looking at Botswana poet T.J. Dema's poem, The Other, in her collection, The Careless Seamstress. By examining how Dema interrogates otherness, I will argue that her poetry actually probes hierarchies of power more effectively than one might expect from poetry, which I have observed is predominantly taken to be an elusive form. It's marketed as beautiful, as aesthetic, but not necessarily active. However, poetry can be a force, a form that can dismantle destructive logics we are currently enmeshed in, and it can do this through its elusiveness. To demonstrate this, I will pit Dema's poetry against Nnedi Okorafor's Binti trilogy, which is a series of science fictional, or more specifically, African futurist novellas. In doing so, we see how two vastly different written and narrative forms, poetry and science fiction, work to quote-unquote decolonize knowledge. Moreover, because of the genre, one might expect the Binti novellas to do more with critiquing the current colonialist logics at work, but Okorafor's supposedly futurist world actually keeps alive heteropatriarchal and racist ideas. It is not as utopic as it is purported to be. However, Dema's collection does do this, even though many of her poems are set in a contemporary or recently past Botswana setting. Due to her attention to critiquing the hierarchies of power at work now, she explores through her poetry ways to subvert them and opens up the space for imagining otherwise. Because Dema points to possible futures by critiquing present moments, her poetry exits that cycle of self-devouring growth seen in narratives of progress, which I will explicate more later on. But first, to enter into these discussions, we must first ask, what is it to decolonize? In Emily Davis's essay, Decolonizing Knowledge in Nnedi Okorafor's Binti trilogy, she investigates the role of knowledge production in decolonizing human rights through Okorafor's science fictional universe. Davis argues that Okorafor's what-if exploration opens up the room for us to imagine optimistically and project our decolonialist goals into the future. In other words, Okorafor's approach to imagining futures through asking what if presents an optimism and creativity that would not otherwise be accessible in the same ways that we write or construct narratives in other genres or styles. To Davis, a decolonial approach to knowledge, stemming from Latin America, is a project that demands we consider other genealogies, other ways of knowing. Due to imposed European deployment of their colonialist intellectual apparatus, decolonizing knowledge thus is the aim to, from Ngugi wa Thiong'o, decolonize the mind, or in other words, think otherwise. I like this simple phrase because it allows me to blow it open, but I will come back to that later. So Davis claims that Binti does just this. The series thinks otherwise. To summarize briefly, the Binti trilogy follows protagonist Binti, who is a member of the oppressed Himba people on Earth, as she leaves her home to pursue studying at the prestigious intergalactic UMSA University. The first book is about her journey there. The second book is about her journey back home. And the third is about her journey saving the worlds and reconciling her multitudes, as she has changed drastically over the series. It is a series that grapples with hate and prejudice, as well as family and belonging. There is much to admire about Okorafor's speculative world, especially what Davis highlights about aspects of the university's dedication to collaborative scholarship. However, she also writes that the series is, quote, utopic in its formulation of family and cross-cultural appreciation. Part of the human rights work of the text is rejecting a capitalist model of cultural commodification that treats bodies as always potential objects for sale or theft, end quote. While this latter notion of labor and exploitation is less apparent, though I would argue it's still present, it would overall be unwise to label the Binti series as utopian. Underwriting many customs, the Himba and Kush people, of the Himba and Kush people, who are the dominant people on Earth, are notes of heteropatriarchy. So for example, Binti is able to see what her people call a night masquerade, which is believed to be a phantom-like vision who is made of dried sticks, leaves, and wood. Until Binti, this had been a phenomenon reserved for the eyes of men and boys only, and within that population, only those deemed worthy of hero status, which implies that men and boys were the only group considered to be remarkable. Okorafor undermines this misogynistic notion by writing that Binti can see the night masquerade, but misogyny was still present for her to disrupt. So Binti's world cannot be utopian. It cannot be no place upon which Okorafor has built an entirely new conceptual world, because traces of this world are carried over into it. Just as well, group-based oppression permeates the plot, not only with women, but with the Kush people discriminating against the Himba, as well as treating the Meduse, who are an octopus-like species, as savages. And further, the Himba people also discriminate against the Enizenaria, or the desert people, as termed by the Himba, because of their darker complexions and hair texture. So colorism, speciesism, and sexism remain persistent throughout Okorafor's speculative world. And just to clarify, I do not think it should fall on Okorafor to write a utopia. I only say this to push against Davis's idealized impression of the series. So as we take all this into account, what I want to focus on specifically is how Binti is othered throughout the series, outcasted from her home for leaving it, as well as for becoming part Meduse, and later again, realizing and embracing her Enizenaria lineage. Despite the depth Binti's multitudes could have spoken to in the series, we are left a bit at a loss at the trilogy's close. Binti frets she is not human anymore, and she is only reassured by an unhelpful doctor that she is quote unquote more. At the finale, we are left wanting, and so is Binti. Her Himba identity is what she has been most deeply connected to the whole series, and even as she has grown, she has kept as firm a hold of it, on it as she can. Yet she is time and again forcefully othered from it, whether that be externally, from her family, situationally, or even within herself, as she is forced to become part Meduse and even part spaceship at the end of the last book. So torn between worlds, there is not much of a feeling of pluralism rather than one of isolation and confusion, even as she ends back up in the purported haven of the university. Thus, Binti's grappling with her otherness does not do much to challenge the colorist, racist, or speciesist hierarchies present. And now to focus back on Dema, let's return to that idea that decolonizing knowledge is to think otherwise. I think poetry does this very thing. When we meet a poem, we live with and within it for a bit. We are in the poem's realm, which is clearly not our own, because we feel compelled to make sense of it, bring it down to terms we can understand, terms that make sense to us. But each time we do this, each time we read a poem, something is different, something changes. It never stays down at our level. It always returns to whatever dimension it belongs to. I don't mean to sound too elusive here. The point I'm trying to make is that poetry as a form, as a force, is untamable. It cannot be contained. In its unique structuring and language games, it resists order. Yet, to echo Bruce Fink, it lives and breathes beyond thinking subjects anyway, and therefore opens up our knowledge worlds the more time we spend with it. Dema's poem, The Other, does just this. In a collection concerned with the rebellion inherent in remedial womanly tasks, this poem tracks displacement and questions the concept of homemaking if one must constantly adapt and move to new environments. The following section, which occurs in the middle of the poem, speaks to this. In these few lines, we already have a sense of the push and pull of assimilation. The speaker's cousin is beginning to walk away from their ways or lose hold of tradition, where he thinks they should not be upset at their dislocation. His claims are shadowed as misguided, especially with his justification that they are not the first people to be moved, recalling the Atlantic slave trade, as to be moved implies that force was used. Thus, the speaker questions what makes a home, if it is simply material, as their cousin might believe, or, as is the insinuation, if something more is required, something they are lacking. In the second to last stanza, the speaker makes an astute observation where they ask, perhaps she is Janus the two-faced, who looks both forward and backward at the same time, but I fear it is much simpler than that. Most people cannot feel a hurt that does not look like them, even if it belongs to them. The girl to whom the speaker refers is someone who is pushing back against the foreign, assumedly European or American, reporter in language by calling herself Botswana, not Botswanian. This passage is still highly obscure to me because it seems to change every time I read it. The imagery of Janus is a vital component to this feeling because as Janus, who is a Roman god with two heads, looking both forward and backward in time, representing duality and crossing, the speaker wonders if this girl's defiance is productive or not. She others herself in this moment, even though her terms may be correct, through speaking out to the journalist. I'd like to highlight the last lines as well, which strike similar chords to a moment in the last book of the Binti series, where Okorafor writes that diversity and peace, quote, was so unlike Earth, where wars were fought over and because of differences, and most couldn't relate to anyone unless they were similar. Yet we do not see these ideas expanded upon. The war between Medus and Kush continues, and no one is sure how the war started. No one really seems to care much either. While Binti ends on an inconclusive note, Dema's poem is specific. Okorafor writes, unless they were similar, but Dema points precisely to the visual component of this othering dimension and separation, which demonstrates the racial prejudice at work and its particular othering effects. I would love to dive deeper into the poem, but for the sake of brevity, I will end with saying that the other demonstrates the weight of survival as you are displaced and your pain is appropriated. Dema does not take these themes lightly. She treats her speaker as one would care for a friend. Their pain is realized and felt, their distance from others and themselves is acknowledged, and we are left to grapple with these pieces, to think of new interpretation after new interpretation about how this relates to our personal situations, how we feel other, how we other, and how we think about familiarity, home, and exile. We ask, how much are we ourselves in our homes? What constitutes a home? Dema does not provide us concrete answers. The poetic form does not allow for this. Instead, we are left to critically examine what these words mean, what impression they leave on our bodies. To recall the quote by Julie Livingston, shown a few slides ago, she argues in her prologue to her book, Self-Devouring Growth, that other forms of knowledge are needed for us to exit the cycle of self-devouring growth, or that which perpetuates exploitative, reductive means for colonialist ends. I want to adapt this concept and transfer it to thinking of writing. Self-devouring growth and narratives of progress, like in Okorafor's, attempt to breach and critique colonialist logics, but end up falling short and reifying hierarchies of power currently at work. However, poetry can be interpreted as another form of knowledge that we can use to divorce ourselves from narratives that postulate growth, but really self-devour in terms of socioeconomic anti-racist progress. Because poetry requires that we break away from how knowledge or language is taken in or understood. Poetry is obscure, and we don't like living in obscurity. We like making sense of things. But in our sense making, we often reduce to terms that are limited and easily understandable. So it enters that cycle again. Poetry challenges the transparency of these ideas. Livingston argues that we ought to think about non-traditional, non-rationalist ways of knowing, and I think poetry is one of these ways. So in conclusion, Okorafor's world could point to an idealized society one may want to live in, but this does not account for the undercurrents of subjection and oppression that Binti as a woman and as a hybrid being faces. Not to say that Dema's worlds projected in the poetry draw a picture of an idealized society, as much of what she writes is past tense or in the current state of Botswana. Rather, more importantly, her poems center those who are silenced, whose bodies are invisibilized or hyper-visibilized, and shows how this violence is a part of a larger ecosystem of domination. While Binti may have the quote unquote room to explore these ideas of power through the science fictional genre, there's actually a lot that Okorafor ends up dismissing or sidestepping. Poetry does not allow for this kind of evasiveness because it is a form that requires time and contemplation. Poetry resists order. So when a writer leverages this power to play with language and form, to push our knowledge to its limits, they push against structure, which is to say, poetry is not easily given to us. We have to work with it, untangle our minds, not the poem, from how we ordinarily think and challenge ourselves to engage with the text. Again, to quote Ngugi, decolonize our minds. The form of poetry, especially when used to ruminate on ideas of domination and suppression, is rebellious because it counters how we ordinarily interact with language, and further, how we ordinarily interact with hierarchies of power. It is shown to us in opaque, multifaceted ways. Thank you very much.